You're tuning into the deep dive because you want to get smart, fast, without feeling buried under an avalanche of information.
And today, we're tackling a big one, Hannah Arendt.
Yeah, a real giant of 20th century thought.
Yeah.
But her work, it isn't some neat little philosophical package, is it?
No, not at all. It's more like a powerful wrestling match with the biggest, most urgent issues of her time. We're talking totalitarianism, revolution, the very meaning of freedom.
And how we even manage to think and judge after, well, after the horrors of the 20th century.
Exactly. Born in 1906, Arendt, she didn't really aim to build a perfect system. Instead, she just relentlessly probed the core of political life.
So our mission today is kind of reconstructing her understanding of what political existence truly means, looking through her specific lens.
That's the idea. And her lens, as you mentioned, is often called phenomenological.
Okay, phenomenology. What does that actually mean in her case? How does she approach these huge questions differently?
Well, think of it as putting lived experience first. Instead of starting with abstract theories about politics, she wanted to uncover the fundamental structures of how we actually experience political life.
So getting underneath the theory to the experience itself.
Pretty much. She was trying to get at the core characteristics of being in the political world as a distinct kind of human experience.
Right. So what were the main themes, the central concerns that kept cropping up in her work?
Well, you'll see her constantly coming back to the possibility and, frankly, the health of democratic public life.
And the things that threaten it.
Absolutely, the forces that endanger it. She was also deeply interested in that tension, between our private concerns and the broader public good.
That public-private divide.
Yeah. And she also looked really closely at how our everyday activities like production and consumption, how those shape our political realities.
Okay. And if you had to pick one idea, the thing she's maybe most famous for, what would it be?
That's tough. But it would likely be her profound exploration of our capacity for human judgment.
Judgment. Especially after everything that happened in the 20th century.
Exactly. After those catastrophes seemed to just shatter all the old moral and political frameworks, she was trying to figure out, okay, how can we still make meaningful judgments in the world now?
This sounds like a pretty intense journey through some heavy topics. How are we going to structure this deep dive? Break it down for us.
Okay, good question. We'll start by tracing the key moments in her life and her major writings, a bit of chronology.
Got it. Life and works first.
Then we'll look at the thinkers who shaped her perspective, her intellectual context.
Heidegger, Jaspers, those figures.
Right. From there, we'll dive into her really groundbreaking analysis of totalitarianism, then her core ideas about the human condition, labor, work, and action.
Okay. Totalitarianism, human condition. What else?
Her thoughts on revolution, which are quite interesting. Then that really controversial concept of the banality of evil that came out of the Eichmann trial.
Yes. That's definitely one we need to unpack carefully.
We will. And finally, we'll land on her later insights into thinking and judging themselves.
Okay. Sounds like a solid plan. Let's start at the beginning then. Hanover, Germany, 1906. What was her early life like?
She was born into a secular Jewish family. They moved around a bit in Germany, Königsberg, then Berlin. Academically, she initially focused on classical studies and Christian theology in Berlin.
Theology first. Interesting.
Yeah, but then she shifted to philosophy in Marburg, and that's where she studied with Martin Heidegger.
Heidegger.
Right.
A hugely influential figure, but also complicated. Their relationship wasn't purely academic, was it?
No, it wasn't. They had a significant and complex romantic relationship for a time. Later, she moved to Heidelberg.
To study with someone else.
Yes, with Karl Jaspers, another major existentialist philosopher. He actually supervised her doctoral work.
What was her dissertation on?
The concept of love in St. Augustine, quite different from her later work. She stayed close to Jaspers, but you can really see Heidegger's phenomenological method leaving a lasting mark on how she thought.
So she finishes her studies, dissertation on Augustine. Then what? Did she jump straight into political engagement?
Pretty much. Her dissertation was published in 1929. She married Gunther Stern in 1930, but even before that, in the late 20s, she was already getting involved in Jewish and Zionist political circles.
So the political side was always there?
It seems so, but then, of course, the rise of Nazism changed everything. That was a seismic event.
Right. She had to flee Germany.
Yes, in 1933. Facing persecution, she fled to Paris, and there she connected with other important intellectuals who are also refugees, like Walter Benjamin and Raymond Aron.
Paris in the 30s must have been an intense time and place for her, both intellectually stimulating and, I imagine terrifying.
Absolutely. And it was in Paris that she met Heinrich Blücher, another German political refugee. She divorced Stern in 1939 and married Blücher in 1940.
But they couldn't stay in France either.
No. With the war escalating and after a brief period of internment herself, they knew they had to get out. They managed to flee to the United States in 1941.
And they settled in New York City?
That's right. New York became her adopted home.
How did she find her footing there, those early years in the U.S., and when did her writing really start to take off?
Well, she wrote for Aufbau, which was a German-language newspaper there. She also did research work for the Commission on European Jewish Cultural Reconstruction.
Important work documenting what was lost?
Definitely. And crucially, around 1944, she began the massive undertaking that would eventually become the origins of totalitarianism.
Ah, the big one.
The big one. The late 40s also saw her publish an essay, What is Existence Philosophy? And she worked as an editor at Schocken Books for a while.
So juggling editing and her own major writing project.
Seems like it. And then, a big year was 1951. She became a U.S. citizen, and The Origins of Totalitarianism was finally published.
And that book really put her on the map, didn't it? Made her a major intellectual voice.
Oh, absolutely. It had a huge impact.
So what came next? What defined the 1950s for her after that success?
Well, the 50s were a time of increasing academic involvement. She held various fellowships, visiting professorships at different American universities.
And more major publications?
Yes. In 1958, she published two more really significant books, The Human Condition.
Another cornerstone of her thought.
Definitely. And also Rahel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewish Woman. Then, in 1959, she stirred up quite a bit of controversy with an essay called Reflections on Little Rock.
Wading into the civil rights movement debates.
Yes, and it wasn't universally well received. Then the 60s arrived, and that decade was really marked by her reporting on the Eichmann trial.
Right. That was hugely influential and, again, deeply controversial.
Hugely. In 1961, she published Between Past and Future, another collection of important essays. And then she went to Jerusalem to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann for The New Yorker.
Now, the articles and then the book.
Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, published in 1963. It just ignited a firestorm of debate that, frankly, continues in some ways today.
And she published on revolution the same year. Busy time.
Incredibly productive, yes. After that, she held academic posts at Berkeley and Chicago, but eventually found a more permanent academic home at the New School for Social Research in New York City, starting in 1967.
Okay. So the later years, the 70s, personal loss, but still intellectually active?
Very much so. Sadly, her husband, Heinrich Blücher, passed away in 1970. That must have been a huge blow.
Of course.
But she continued working intensely. That same year, she gave a really important seminar on Kant's philosophy of judgment.
Which became a book later.
Yes, published after her death as Lectures on Kant's Political Philosophy. She also published Thinking and Moral Considerations in 71 and Crises of the Republic in 72.
And she started that final big project.
The Life of the Mind, an ambitious 3-volume work. The volumes on Thinking and Willing came out posthumously. She passed away in December 1975, just as she was starting work on the final volume, Judging.
Wow. What a life. Just relentlessly productive and engaged right to the end.
Truly remarkable.
Okay, so we have the outline of her life and work. Now let's dig into the intellectual currents that shaped her thinking. You mentioned Heidegger and Jaspers, obviously key figures, but her influences were much wider, right?
Oh, absolutely. While Heidegger and Jaspers were definitely formative, especially methodologically, her intellectual world was incredibly rich and diverse. As we said, she resisted being pigeonholed into any single philosophical school.
She wasn't just an existentialist or a phenomenologist.
Not easily, no. Her work engages with a huge range of thinkers across history. You see her grappling with Aristotle, Augustine, Kant, Nietzsche. The list goes on.
So how did she bring all these different threads together? You mentioned the phenomenological approach from Heidegger and Jaspers as a key method.
Yes, that's a crucial thread. She really prioritized the experiential dimension of human existence. The goal was always to try and uncover the fundamental structures of political experience as it's actually lived and felt by people.
Trying to get back to the things themselves, as the phenomenologists say.
Exactly, to the immediate reality of our political interactions before we layer too much theory on top.
And what was it about Heidegger's philosophy specifically, besides the personal connection, that really stuck with her?
Well, they shared a deep skepticism towards abstract philosophical speculation that seemed detached from the urgent realities of the world.
A critique of philosophy becoming too academic, maybe.
Sort of, yeah. And both were critical of modern society's tendency towards purely instrumental thinking, trying to control and manage everything. And crucially, they both stress the fundamental importance of plurality and difference, the fact that we exist together with other unique individuals.
That appearing to each other is central.
Right. That's fundamental to being human in the world.
But obviously there were huge divergences too, especially given Heidegger's involvement with the Nazis.
Oh, absolutely. Arendt was incredibly critical of his political choices and what she saw as his later retreat from direct political engagement into a more maybe abstract, poetic kind of thinking.
But you still see echoes of his early work, like Being and Time, in her own projects.
You do. Think about Heidegger's existentials, his framework for understanding the basic ways humans exist in the world. Arendt, in a way, does something similar, but focuses it specifically on the political realm.
So when she talks about labor, work, and action in the human condition, that's like her version of mapping out the structures of political existence.
That's a good way to put it. It's a phenomenological exploration of the fundamental structures of human activity as they relate to our political life and experience. They aren't just abstract categories, they're about revealing the inherent character of these activities as we live them.
So it's about uncovering these deep structures of our lived experience, not just imposing a theory from above.
Exactly. She really believed that our everyday life world, that shared world of experiences and meanings, is primary. Philosophical concepts, she worried, could actually sometimes obscure this pre-reflective understanding.
Get in the way.
Yeah, so her aim was often to try and clear away the distortions she saw in traditional political philosophy to get back to the original character of political experience, which she felt had often been overlooked or misunderstood.
Is that clearing away process similar to Heidegger's idea of destruction, dismantling the tradition?
You got it. Very similar impulse. Just as Heidegger wanted to dismantle layers of Western metaphysics to get at a more original understanding of being, Arendt used a similar critical approach to dismantle what she saw as the distorting concepts of traditional political philosophy.
Because those concepts carried hidden assumptions.
Right. Assumptions that could prevent us from seeing political phenomena clearly as they are genuinely experienced.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. With that intellectual backdrop, let's turn to one of the most defining parts of her work, her analysis of totalitarianism. This was obviously deeply personal for her.
Absolutely. The origins of totalitarianism was her direct attempt to grapple with the rise of Nazism and Stalinism. Her core argument, and it was quite radical at the time, was that these regimes weren't just, worse versions of old tyrannies.
It was something fundamentally new.
Yes. A completely new form of government, she called it. One built on the systematic use of terror and a rigid adherence to ideological fictions.
What made it so radically different from, say, traditional dictatorships?
Well, in older tyrannies, terror was usually a tool, a means to an end, seizing power, silencing opposition. But in totalitarian regimes, Arendt argued, terror became almost an end in itself.
Not just a tool, but the essence of the system.
In large part, yes. The terror often wasn't guided by clear strategic goals beyond perpetuating itself and enforcing the ideology, and it was justified by these grand, pseudo-scientific claims about immutable laws of history, like class struggle, or laws of nature, like racial purity.
So it wasn't just about power, it was about forcing reality itself to conform to this invented ideological world.
Precisely. And Arendt was really interested in how these ideologies gained such traction, how they could mobilize entire populations.
What was her explanation for that popular appeal?
She pointed to the breakdown of stable social and political structures, things like World War I, the Great Depression, massive social upheaval. These events left people feeling isolated, atomized, rootless.
Adrift, looking for answers.
Exactly. Desperately searching for a single, clear explanation for why things were so bad and maybe a guarantee of security in the future.
And these total ideologies offered that simple, all-encompassing answer, even if it was based on lies.
They did. They offered a supposed key to history, a narrative that explained everything past, present, and future if you just submitted to the ideology without question. But she also argued this vulnerability wasn't just sudden. It was the result of longer-term trends that had eroded the public sphere.
What kind of trends?
Things like 19th century imperialism, the bureaucratic methods used to control colonial populations, the way the bourgeoisie increasingly used the state just to protect its economic interests, sidelining real political debate.
So these things weaken the space where citizens could actually engage with each other politically, creating a kind of vacuum.
That's a crucial part of her analysis.
Hmm?
These developments led to a decline in the legitimacy of political institutions and weakened the very principles of citizenship and reasoned public debate that a healthy democracy relies on.
So totalitarianism wasn't just a bolt from the blue. It arose from the gradual decay of a viable public life.
That's her argument. A public life that could unite citizens while still respecting their freedom and their differences, what she famously called plurality. The core insight here is really that the erosion of a vibrant public sphere makes a society susceptible to the terrifying promises of totalitarian movements.
And these themes he tackled in Origins, the importance of the public sphere, the threats to it, that tension between public and private. These threads run through her later work too, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Origins really lays the groundwork. The questions she raises there about the conditions for democratic public life, the dangers it faces, the interplay of public and private, they become recurring themes she explores in much greater depth later on. She keeps circling back to this fundamental question: what is political existence and what makes it possible?
Which leads us perfectly into the human condition. After dissecting the darkness, she seems to shift focus here to defining the positive conditions for genuine political experience.
Exactly. Published in 1958, The Human Condition is this sweeping historical and philosophical investigation. She goes way back, especially to ancient Greece, to the roots of democracy and political thought.
Why go back so far?
Because she saw a decline, a kind of forgetting of authentic political life in the modern era. Her goal was to offer this, well, phenomenological reconstruction of the basic kinds of human activity.
To figure out which activities really count as political.
Right. To understand what kind of action and engagement truly constitutes political existence and how that understanding got obscured over time.
And in doing that, she ends up being quite critical of the Western philosophical tradition itself.
Yes, very much so. She argues that Western philosophy, going back to Plato, has historically tended to devalue the realm of active human engagement in the world, what she calls the vita activa, the active life.
In favor of what?
In favor of the vita contemplativa, the life of contemplation, focused on supposedly eternal, unchanging truths. She sees Plato as a key figure here.
With the allegory of the cave.
Exactly. His framework, especially in the Republic, sets up this hierarchy where the messy world of human affairs, of action and opinion, is seen as just a shadowy, inferior copy compared to the perfect, unchanging world of ideas or forms.
So philosophy points away from the world, towards abstract contemplation.
That's the tendency she critiques. Plato elevates theoria, contemplation, over praxis, action, and episteme, certain knowledge, over doxa, mere opinion.
And Arendt wants to flip that, or at least rebalance it.
Precisely. Her project in The Human Condition and Beyond is really to reclaim the value and dignity of action and appearance the world we share with others. She wants to rescue the shared life of politics and the importance of diverse opinions from this philosophical depreciation.
To argue that public and political action are actually among the highest forms of human activity, not something secondary.
Exactly. So the core insight there is that by consistently prioritizing contemplation over action, Western philosophy unintentionally helped diminish our understanding and appreciation of genuine political life.
Okay, so to make this case, she famously breaks down the vita activa, the active life, into three distinct activities: labor, work, and action. And this isn't just categorization for its own sake, right? There's a hierarchy involved.
That's right. It's a tripartite division. Labor, which is about our biological needs. Work, which is about making a durable human world. And action, which is about our political interactions with others. And crucially, she argues that the modern age has kind of flipped this hierarchy upside down.
With bad consequences.
With detrimental consequences for political freedom and responsibility, in her view.
Okay, let's take them one by one. Labor first. This is the most basic level, tied to survival.
Yes. Labor is the activity that corresponds directly to the biological processes of human life. The essential tasks we perform just to stay alive, to sustain ourselves and the species.
Like growing food, eating, sleeping.
Exactly. It's characterized by its cyclical nature, its endlessness. It doesn't produce anything permanent. Its results are consumed almost immediately, so it has to be constantly repeated.
And this is where we're closest to animals.
That's how she puts it. We are animal laborans, the laboring animal in this mode. And because it's driven purely by necessity, by the need to survive, she argues the animal laborans lacks real freedom. It's almost like a slave to biological imperatives.
Which puts her at odds with someone like Marx, who emphasized labor's importance.
Oh, definitely. She's very critical of what she sees as Marx's elevation of labor. For her, it's a fundamental misunderstanding to put the activity driven by necessity at the forefront of human existence.
She connects this to the ancient Greek distinction between the private and public realms.
Yes, drawing on Aristotle's distinction between the oikos, the private household concerned with necessity and survival, and the polis, the public realm of freedom and politics. She argues that matters of labor and economics properly belong in the private oikos, not the public polis.
Why is that distinction so important for her?
Because the public sphere, the polis, should be the realm of freedom, where we engage as citizens, not just as beings driven by need. The core insight here is that focusing too much on labor obscures the unique human capacity for freedom and political action.
Okay, and this relates to her critique of the rise of the social. What does she mean by that?
The rise of the social is her term for the historical process, where these concerns of the private household economic production, managing necessities, welfare increasingly invade and come to dominate the public sphere.
So things that used to be private matters become the main business of government and public life.
Exactly. For Arendt, this is disastrous because it essentially overwhelms the properly political realm. The public space, which should be dedicated to freedom and collective action, becomes subordinate to managing biological necessity and economic administration.
Like modern societies focus on economic growth and managing the welfare state.
Precisely. She sees this obsession with satisfying needs as overshadowing the potential for meaningful political agency, for citizens acting together freely to shape their common world. The core insight is that when the public sphere gets bogged down in managing private needs, the space for genuine political freedom shrinks dramatically.
Okay, so labor is about necessity, cycles, and ideally stays private. Next up is work. This is different. This is homo faber, the maker.
Exactly. Work corresponds to what she calls the unnaturalness of human existence, our ability to create an artificial, human-made world of things. Unlike labor's products, which are consumed, the products of work are durable. They last.
This is about building the physical world around us.
Yes, building the world in the sense of a stable, objective artifice that stands apart from nature and provides a home for humans. Think of the craftsman making a table, the architect designing a building, the artist creating a sculpture, even the lawmaker drafting a constitution. These things endure.
They create a shared, tangible world.
Precisely. Work creates a world characterized by durability and relative permanence. It shapes nature according to human plans, often violating natural processes to do so, and it exhibits a degree of freedom because it's guided by human ends and designs.
And unlike labor, work is inherently public.
Yes, because it produces this shared objective world, the stage upon which political life can unfold. The common spaces, institutions, cultural objects, these are products of work, and they're essential preconditions for a political community. They connect people across time. The core insight is that work builds the stable, shared world necessary for politics to even happen.
But she sees this realm of homo faber, the world builder, as also being under threat in modernity.
Yes. Just as the political realm is threatened by the rise of the social, the durable world created by homo faber is threatened by the logic of labor and consumption becoming dominant.
How so?
Well, in a society obsessed with endless production and immediate consumption, the values of permanence, stability, and durability, the hallmarks of work get pushed aside. Everything becomes disposable.
Leading to what she calls world alienation.
Exactly. A sense of disconnection from a stable, shared world that transcends our individual lives. Industrial modernity, with its focus on process and consumption, undermines the creation and preservation of a lasting common world. The core insight is that the modern emphasis on fleeting consumption erodes our connection to a shared, durable world, which is the necessary stage for politics.
Okay, so we've had labor, necessity, private, and work. Durability, world building. Finally, we get to action. This is the highest category for Arendt, the most political.
Yes. For Arendt, action is the pinnacle of the vita activa. Its defining characteristic is its irreducible freedom. Action is an end in itself. It's not done for the sake of survival like labor, or to produce an object like work.
And freedom here isn't just an inner feeling.
No, that's crucial. Freedom for Arendt is active, worldly, public. It's something we do together. Our inner sense of freedom actually arises from the experience of acting freely in the world with others.
And this connects to Augustine's idea of beginnings, initium.
Absolutely. She draws heavily on Augustine's idea that humans, simply by being born, are initium, beginners. Each birth introduces something new into the world. This capacity to begin, to take initiative, is the essence of action.
So freedom is tied to this power of initiative.
Yes. Freedom is an accessory of doing and acting, she says. We are free when we act, when we start something new in concert with others. This capacity for initiation is what introduces genuine novelty. The unexpected, the unpredictable, she even uses the word miracle into human affairs. The core insight is that our capacity for action is inseparable from our freedom and our ability to bring novelty into the world.
Which makes it radically different from just behavior.
Exactly. Behavior is often predictable, habitual, maybe even causally determined. Action, for Arendt, transcends that realm of necessity and predictability. It's genuinely free.
And this is why she's critical of historical determinism, like in Hegel or Marx.
Precisely, because those views, she felt, deny this fundamental human capacity to initiate the genuinely new, to break from predictable patterns.
And action is fundamentally public. It can only happen with others.
Yes, action is always experienced in relation to others. It requires a human politics.
Yeah.
It corresponds directly to what she calls the fundamental human condition of plurality.
Plurality.
Meaning the simple, basic fact that we live on Earth not as solitary individuals nor as interchangeable copies of man, but as distinct, unique persons among other distinct, unique persons. This plurality, she says, is the conditio per quam, the condition through which all political life exists.
So our uniqueness matters politically.
Immensely. The meaning of our actions and even our own identities as actors are only revealed and established within this web of human relationships, this context of plurality.
And how do we reveal ourselves in action? Is speech central here?
Absolutely central. For Arendt, action and speech are almost inseparable in the political realm. Through speech, we disclose who we are, not just what we are. Action reveals the agent in the deed and the word.
So this requires a public space, like the ancient Greek polis.
Yes. Arendt often idealizes the polis as that kind of space where citizens could appear before one another, engage in free speech and persuasion, and collectively act. Politics, in its truest sense for her, is this ongoing activity of citizens exercising their capacity for action.
So politics and freedom, understood as action, are basically the same thing for her.
Essentially, yes. Politics is the practice of freedom among equals. The core insight is that public speech and collaborative action, within a context of human plurality, constitute the very essence of political freedom.
Okay, that's a powerful framework. Labor, work, action. But having laid that out in the human condition, it might seem like this authentic political action is mostly lost in the modern world. Yet then she writes, on revolution. Is she looking for sparks of that freedom in modern times?
Yes, exactly. Published 1963, same year as the Eichmann book, On Revolution takes those core concepts from the human condition and applies them to modern revolutionary events, especially the American and French revolutions.
And her take isn't quite the standard one, is it? Neither purely liberal nor Marxist.
No, she offers a pretty distinct interpretation. She disagrees with liberal accounts that see revolutions primarily as efforts to establish limited government to protect individual rights that existed beforehand.
And she disagrees with Marxists, too.
Yes. She disputes the idea that the driving force, particularly of the French Revolution, was primarily the social question, the struggle against poverty and inequality.
So if it wasn't mainly about rights or economics for her, what was the most significant thing about these revolutions?
For Arendt, the crucial element was the experience, however fleeting, of people acting together, exercising those fundamental political capacities she identified. Individuals coming together based on shared purposes to create a new, tangible public space where freedom could be actively practiced.
So the revolution itself was the political action, the creation of a space for freedom.
That's the key. It's the attempt to found a new public realm, a new set of institutions specifically designed for freedom and active citizenship. That's what made these moments profound examples of politics as action. The core insight is that revolutions, at their best, are about the shared creation of a new space for political freedom.
But she wasn't entirely optimistic about how they turned out. She saw failures in both the French and American cases.
Right. She argues that both ultimately failed, in different ways, to establish and preserve a lasting political space for that kind of ongoing citizen deliberation, decision-making, and action.
How did the French Revolution fall short, in her view?
She argued it got bogged down by the overwhelming pressure to solve the social question, the problem of mass poverty. Political freedom became secondary to managing welfare and necessity. Political institutions were reduced to tools of administration rather than spaces for free action.
And the American Revolution, she saw it as more successful in some ways.
Yes, she thought it was more successful in actually founding a stable political society based on mutual consent, embodied in the Constitution. However,
There's a but.
there's a but. She believed it ultimately failed to create sufficient institutional spaces for citizens to continue participating actively in government beyond just electing representatives. The spirit of active engagement that fueled the revolution itself didn't get built into the permanent structures of the republic.
So, citizens had rights, but not necessarily ongoing opportunities to exercise their political capacities, to judge and rule together.
That was her critique. The core insight is that both revolutions, despite their initial promise of creating spaces for freedom, ultimately struggled to institutionalize that participatory spirit for the long haul.
This discussion of founding new political spaces and the capacities needed leads us naturally to a later phase in her work. It seems she shifted focus somewhat from the nature of action itself to the underlying faculties that make responsible action possible or impossible.
That's a good way to put it. There's a discernible shift, particularly evident in her work on the Eichmann trial.
Right, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and that incredibly provocative phrase, the banality of evil. This seems like a major turning point.
It really was. The book, published in 1963, moves the focus towards examining the mental and moral capacities, thinking and judging, that either support or undermine our ability to act responsibly, especially in extreme political situations.
The banality of evil. Let's unpack that carefully. What did she mean by calling evil banal in Eichmann's case? It still sparks so much debate.
It does, and it's often misunderstood. She wasn't saying his actions helping organize the transport of millions to their deaths were commonplace or trivial. Absolutely not.
So banal didn't refer to the deeds themselves.
No. Her controversial claim was about Eichmann, the person, the perpetrator. Based on observing his trial, she concluded he wasn't some monstrous embodiment of radical evil, driven by deep hatred or sadistic impulses.
He wasn't Iago or Richard III.
Exactly. Instead, she saw him as disturbingly and terrifyingly normal. Almost mediocre. His evil, she argued, stemmed not from a wicked will, but from a stunning, profound thoughtlessness, a failure or absence of the basic human faculties of thinking and judging.
So the banality was in the source of the evil, this emptiness, this lack of thinking.
Precisely. She argued Eichmann acted unreflectively. He was just a bureaucrat, a functionary, incredibly efficient at following orders and organizing logistics, but apparently without ever stopping to genuinely think about the horrific human reality of what he was doing.
The consequences for his victims were just abstract numbers or administrative problems.
That's how she perceived it. The human dimension seemed completely unreal to him. The chilling takeaway for her was that immense, world-destroying evil doesn't necessarily require demonic motives. It can arise from this terrifying emptiness, this inability or refusal to think critically and exercise moral judgment.
She described him as almost constitutionally incapable of the kind of judgment that would make the suffering of others real to him.
Yes. It wasn't necessarily active malice, but rather the absence of something crucial. The imaginative capacity to grasp the moral significance of his actions, to see things from the perspective of others.
He couldn't engage in that internal dialogue, that self-reflection she called thinking.
Apparently not, in her assessment. And without that internal conversation, he couldn't engage in judgment, the ability to evaluate his actions from a broader moral standpoint, considering the perspective of those affected. This link she identified between complicity and great evil and the failure of thinking and judging became a driving force behind her later work.
Which brings us neatly to that final, unfinished project, The Life of the Mind, and her lectures on Kant. This is where she really tries to systematically explore these faculties of thinking and judging.
Yes. While these themes were present earlier, her last years were dedicated to a much deeper dive into these specific mental capacities. The Life of the Mind was planned in 3 parts: thinking, willing, and judging.
But she only finished the first 2 before her death.
That's right. But her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, published posthumously, give us a very good sense of her mature thoughts on political judgment, which would likely have formed the core of that final volume.
Okay, let's start with thinking.
Yeah.
She draws a pretty sharp line between thinking and just knowing facts, right? Borrowing from Kant.
Exactly. She builds on Kant's distinction between Verstand, understanding, the faculty we use to gain factual knowledge, categorize things, make sense of the empirical world, and vernuntive reason. For Arendt, thinking is closer to Kant's vernuntive.
How so? What does thinking do that knowing doesn't?
Thinking, for Arendt, goes beyond established facts and knowledge. It's the restless human activity of grappling with questions of meaning, questions that often don't have simple, definitive answers, like what is justice? What is happiness?
The big unanswerable questions.
Right. Thinking is this constant search for meaning, this questioning of our experiences in the world around us. Its value isn't in producing settled results or doctrines, but in the ongoing activity itself, the process of questioning and re-examining.
And this is vital for political responsibility.
Absolutely essential, she believed. The failure to engage in this kind of critical, meaning-seeking thought was precisely what characterized Eichmann's banality. The core insight is that thinking, in her specific sense, is about a continuous quest for meaning, not just collecting facts, and this quest is crucial for being a responsible moral and political agent.
Okay. And then there's judging. A related faculty, but distinct.
Yes, deeply linked but distinct. And her theory of judgment is often considered one of her most original and, I think, enduring contributions.
What was her main concern regarding judgment in the modern world?
She saw a kind of crisis of judgment. She often lamented this modern alienation from the world, the breakdown of shared traditions and stable frameworks that used to provide common standards for evaluating things.
And this ties back to action bringing novelty.
Exactly. Because action constantly introduces the new and unexpected, it challenges our existing categories of understanding. We can't just rely on old rules or precedents forever.
Especially when faced with the unprecedented horrors of the 20th century.
Precisely. Events like the World Wars, totalitarianism, genocide, these shattered the existing moral and political standards. The tradition, as she put it, lay in fragments. We couldn't just apply old labels.
So the crucial question became, how do we judge these unprecedented events and actions without simply falling back on worn-out categories or rules? How do we engage in thinking without banisters, as she called it?
Exactly. This requires an independent faculty of judgment, one that can operate even when the old handrails of tradition are gone. The core insight is that the unpredictable nature of human action demands a faculty of judgment capable of navigating novelty without fixed rules.
And again, she found inspiration in Kant, specifically his critique of judgment.
Yes, particularly his concept of reflective judgment. Kant distinguished between determinate judgment, where you have a general rule and you just apply it to a specific case, like classifying a plant, and reflective judgment.
What's reflective judgment?
That's the kind of judgment needed when you have a particular case, but you don't have a pre-existing universal rule or concept to subsume it under. You have to find the universal from the particular. This is the judgment we need for unique events, for aesthetic appreciation, and, Arendt argues, for political life.
And how does this reflective judgment work? How can it claim any validity if there's no pre-existing rule?
This is the brilliant part she draws from Kant. Reflective judgment, while starting with the particular, involves a universalizing move. It appeals to a potential agreement from others. It's based on a capacity Kant believed all humans share, a sensus communis, a common sense, but not in the folksy way.
More like a shared capacity for judgment.
Yes, a shared capacity to judge from a common standpoint, setting aside purely private interests and biases. It requires being disinterested.
Trying to see it from a more general perspective.
Exactly, and this is where Arendt introduces her crucial idea of the enlarged mentality, erweiterte Denkungsart. This is the capacity to think in the place of everyone else.
How do you do that?
Through imagination, by training the imagination to go visiting, as she colorfully put it. You actively try to represent to yourself the viewpoints of others, especially those different from you, and take them into account in your own judgment.
So it's about cultivating an imaginative empathy, trying to see the issue from multiple perspectives.
Precisely. It's not about simply adopting others' views, but about broadening your own perspective by considering theirs.
And this enlarged mentality allows our individual judgments, even about unprecedented things, to potentially claim a kind of public validity.
That's the argument. Because the judgment is formed by considering a common world from multiple standpoints, it's no longer purely subjective. This provides a basis for a disinterested, public-minded political judgment capable of dealing with novelty and complexity. The core insight is that through imaginative perspective-taking, we can form judgments that transcend purely personal bias and can guide responsible action in a shared world, even without fixed rules.
That's a really powerful and, frankly, demanding idea. It's no wonder her work, despite complexities and controversies, has had such a lasting impact.
Oh, absolutely. Her influence is undeniable. Her analyses of totalitarianism and political violence remain foundational texts.
People still grapple with origins.
They do. And her reflections on revolution have been hugely important for contemporary Republican thought and for understanding civic mobilization today.
And her ideas on deliberation and communication.
Massively influential, especially on critical theorists like Jürgen Habermas. His theory of communicative reason owes a significant debt to Arendt's emphasis on public discourse.
What about her concept of power?
Also very influential. Her idea of power as the human ability to act in concert, something generated between people through communication and consent, as distinct from force or violence. That's been a really key contribution.
And her later work on judgment.
That continues to resonate, particularly in critical theory and postmodern thought, especially in debates about ethics after foundationalism. Thinkers like Salah Ben Habib have explicitly drawn on Arendt to refine discourse ethics, and others like Lyotard found resources in her work for thinking about judgment in the absence of universal criteria.
Of course, no thinker, especially one as provocative as Arendt, escapes criticism. What are some of the main critiques leveled against her?
Well, one persistent line of criticism targets that sharp distinction she draws between the private realm of the oikos and the public realm of the polis.
The labor work versus action distinction, essentially.
Right. Feminist critics, for instance, have argued that this historically served to devalue and exclude women's experiences and concerns, often relegated to the private sphere, from being considered genuinely political.
And Marxists have issues, too.
Yes, critiquing her tendency to push issues of economic justice and material distribution out of the core political realm, seeing them as social rather than properly political concerns.
That infamous comment about housing not being a political issue comes to mind.
Exactly. That's often cited as an example of the potential limitations of her framework. Others criticize what they see as an overly idealized view of the Athenian polis, perhaps glossing over its exclusions and limitations.
Like slavery and the exclusion of women.
Precisely. And some argue her emphasis on direct citizen deliberation might be impractical or even utopian in modern, large, complex, mass societies.
Is face-to-face polis-style politics feasible today?
That's the question. Others take issue with her sometimes stark elevation of politics as action above other valuable forms of human activity. And of course, like any major interpreter of philosophical history, her specific readings of thinkers like Plato, Marx, or Kant have been debated by specialists.
So valid criticisms and ongoing debates exist, but her overall stature remains.
Without a doubt. Despite the critiques, Hannah Arendt stands as one of the most original, challenging, and deeply influential political thinkers of the 20th century. Her work just continues to provoke and inspire.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Hannah Arendt, what are the absolute core takeaways listeners should hold on to?
I think it's her relentless focus on the nature of political action itself, what it means to act freely together in a shared world. Her profound analysis of totalitarianism as a uniquely modern threat, her insistence on the vital importance of a vibrant public sphere for freedom, and, crucially, her exploration of thinking and judging as indispensable capacities for navigating our complex world responsibly. The core insight is really her constant challenge to us. Think about what it means to be political, to be free, and to be responsible in dark times.
And her method, that phenomenological approach of starting with lived experience, offers a powerful way to cut through abstract jargon and connect with the real structures of our political lives, doesn't it?
It really does. Her questions about freedom, authority, power, and the conditions needed for a meaningful political existence, these feel incredibly relevant, maybe even more urgent today.
So let me leave our listeners with a final thought to chew on. In our current moment, saturated with information, facing rapid change, dealing with events that often feel unprecedented, how do Arendt's ideas about judgment, this thinking without banisters, really land? How do we cultivate that enlarged mentality she spoke of, that ability to imaginatively visit other perspectives in order to navigate the political and ethical maze we find ourselves in? How do we balance our private lives with the demands of a shared public world? That's something Arendt pushes us to consider, and it's definitely worth pondering long after this deep dive ends.
Absolutely. And for anyone whose interest is piqued, diving into her major works, The Origins of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition, Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Life of the Mind is a challenging but incredibly rewarding experience. They offer no easy answers, but they ask profoundly important questions.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.